Good afternoon and welcome to our weekly livestock market update. I'm Brownfield News Anchor reporter Meghan Grebner. With us is University of Missouri, Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Meghan.
All right, as we get into this week and some of our discussions, let's start first and talk a little bit about the market recap and what happened this week.
Yeah, when we look at the hog side to begin with, cash hogs have been fairly flat for the week. And we've also seen then the pork cutout value that very little change relative to a week ago. So no change really occurring in pork markets after last week being a down week. When we look at the cattle side of the market, feeder calves steady to 3 higher, feeder cattle steady to 4 higher this week. Pork cutout value up another $7 a hundred this week, driven in large part by what we saw happening in rib and loin prices. Yesterday's close on the beef cutout value was highest since mid-June of 2016. Fed cattle also stronger, 3 to 4 higher this week. So it's been a good week in terms of cattle markets.
As we get into our discussions this week, Scott, we're actually going to talk a lot about the consumer relationship and the consumer side of things as it relates to beef and pork. Consumer sentiment came out this week, and definitely another good number and a feel-good number from that report.
Yeah, so a number of things out of consumer confidence this week that makes me more excited about demand strength for 2017. First of all, when you look at the overall index from March of 2017, it was up 1.3% relative to a month ago, up over 7% relative to a year ago, setting at 97.6. It just continues to suggest that we're seeing consumer confidence continuing to grow. Most important is that current economic situation that we're seeing out there. So relative to a month ago, up almost 3%, over 8% higher relative to a year ago. So it's not just expectations that are driving that overall index. It's the current situation that consumers are suggesting is better for them. We hit a 114.5 for March of 2017. In comparison, in February, we were at 111.5. Expectations are also up a little bit relative to a month ago. A year ago, we're still up 6% when you look at the expectations index as well. So across the board, we're seeing more optimism from consumers out of that consumer index.
When we see optimism from consumers and we see strength in buying, does that lend support to retail prices as well if there's a solid and continuous demand?
Absolutely. I think we have some great opportunities when you look at the retail side of the picture with that kind of consumer confidence. And you know, it's interesting that, you know, if you look back at 2009, so I'll go back for a minute and go, very tough period of time. And I think it's taken us a long time to kind of put 2009 in the rearview mirror. But there seems to be a lot more confidence about where the general economy is headed, given these latest numbers. And I talk about that unrelated to the political side of the spectrum that we have going on, that perhaps we're starting to see real signals. We're getting stronger growth in the economy. Companies are willing to get more jobs as a result of that. And the kind of the ball, I believe, has begun to roll in terms of giving us ultimately better meat demand in this country in 2017. And all of that leads to higher retail prices, which is nothing but good for us.
As we talk about those retail prices, why is there a balance? Can they get too high, and that maybe would back off some of the purchases or domestic demand for beef and pork? And does it really matter to producers on their side of things where the retail prices end up?
Yeah, well, so I sometimes go this whole reverse logic of we want lower consumer prices as producers so we can move more product. May not be the right strategy over the long term. So if we look at the data that we have on retail prices, I start with beef for a minute. So yes, beef retail prices in February of this year were almost 18 cents higher than a month ago, but they were still 14 cents lower than a year ago, right? So we have to keep it in perspective. Same thing on the pork side. Pork was up over 7 cents for the month, but still down almost 10 cents relative to a year ago. So I like to say higher retail prices, ultimately, maybe we can talk about passing more of that down to farmers at the end of the day. I certainly know that lower retail prices translate into lower farm prices for producers, by the way. So we can talk a lot about who gets that share of the consumer dollar, but having February data tell us that we have higher retail prices relative to January of this year, for me, is a bright spot. It again highlights that demand for beef and pork has been stronger as we've started 2017.
You bring up the producer share. One of the county farm bureaus where I'm from last week had a breakfast to highlight what the farmers' share of that food dollar cost is. As we look at the big picture of that, Scott, how does it relate to cattle and hog producers? And is their share growing as well right now?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. This is all about everybody along the chain until we get to the farm, and in terms of what's happening. I again rewind for a minute. If you look back in 2014, we saw the beef farmer's share of the consumer dollar almost reach 60%, which is abnormally high, by the way. And it tells you that when you have tight supplies, that a lot more of that dollar keeps getting passed down as we're trying to bid for that limited supply of cattle that are out there. After we started growing beef supplies, we went from almost 60% of the consumer dollar all the way down to about 38% of the consumer dollar when we got in about October of 2016, which, by the way, corresponds with that bottom of cattle prices. Since then, we've seen recovery. We're back up to about 45% of the share of the consumer dollar on the beef side, which I would say is a longer-term average for us, but it reminds us that we did get some recovery as we went through the latter part of 2016 and early 2017. As I will say, retail demand got stronger. I think packers have been willing to bid a little harder for cattle. It's helped increase that share back to maybe what's more longer-term average. On the pork side, it's a very similar situation as well. Back in 2014, with the disease issues that we faced, we saw the peak of about 40% of that consumer dollar getting back to barrel and gilt prices, whereas when we got in the late 2016, it was all the way down to about 16%. It has recovered. There's cyclical behavior in these as well, especially showing up in the pork side. We set at about 25% of the consumer dollar today on the pork side, which, if you think about that data for a minute, we're probably still below the kind of the longer term average on pork prices. We got more pork processing coming on board in 2017. It might suggest to me that we have some ability to continue to see a larger proportion of that consumer dollar on the pork side trickle down to barrel and gilt prices. So that's another positive to talk about on the pork side.
And I would still think, though, so much of this hinges on strong demand for our products.
Absolutely. Strong demand for our products in this country. And when you see things like loin and rib prices that have been stronger, when you see some strength in those cutout values of both beef and pork, we need that to continue. I continue to say that's the biggest wild card for us. Can we hold the kind of demand strength that we've seen? And we're now seeing enough observations to suggest we're starting to get on a trend of some better demand. But if something happens to the general economy that turns down consumer demand for our products, I worry about where prices go.
Scott, Fair to Finish returns released this week for Iowa State, or from Iowa State. Another more positive news for pork producers.
Absolutely. When you look at just the amount of growth in pork production, the number of sows we have, et cetera, to talk about a February estimate that shows profitability of about $22 a hog, that's very good news. The most profitable month since June of 2016. I'm not certain I would have anticipated that strength, and it's really driven by what's been higher hog prices. The run we've seen in hog prices since late 2016 has done nothing but be helpful to hog producers. I sometimes use this as a chance, so all the time when we have low hog prices, I get the idea of, should I be using risk management tools to be locking in prices? I might remind us, with the higher prices we have right now, maybe now's the time to be thinking about risk management. I'd much rather lock in higher prices than waiting for prices to move much lower to then to decide I want to do some risk management. So we'll wait and see whether that's the right strategy or not. But just the strength we've had, I sure hope some risk management considerations are being taken on both cattle and hogs.
I'm going to throw you a little curveball. It is St. Patrick's Day after all. Good demand for the corned beef side of things as I think about everybody enjoying corned beef and cabbage to celebrate St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, it's nothing but good news, right? I mean, we need that demand on the beef side, and it's a chance to move some beef product that we normally maybe don't see the same demand strength for. So it is nice to have these come along to give us a little extra pop in markets. And I will say, we already talked about maybe grilling season started a little sooner, but we're getting a lot closer to where I think we can officially start talking about the start of grilling season and hopefully some stronger demand on the beef side as well.
We've had a lot of great news to talk about this week. Obviously, some concern, a second case of high-path avian flu detected in that control zone in southern Tennessee. As we look at that, we look at import bans from South Korea and some other countries. We know it has a direct impact to the poultry industry, but what about that spillover effect into pork and beef as we see maybe a glut of poultry, depending on how long this ban goes, enter the U.S. market and we have to deal with it on the domestic side?
Yeah, well, so we have to remain vigilant in terms of what's happening on the poultry side. We are again, as you mentioned, another case occurring. For me, it's all about what happens as we move forward. More cases, and then I think you start to see the loss of additional markets where maybe today they're talking about some type of county or more regional ban that allows us still to ship a lot of poultry products. But if we lose those markets and we have poultry that does back up into the United States, it's not a chicken only issue that we then face. Where it'll be very strong competition for domestic consumption, and I think that's a drag on pork and beef prices as well. So it goes beyond chicken when we start talking about large losses of export markets. Let's all hope that doesn't happen as we look ahead. And I will say, it seems like when I see the local officials that are dealing with avian influenza today, we've been very proactive in trying to make sure we limit the spread, and hopefully we'll be successful in those endeavors over the next few weeks.
Anything else to touch on this week?
I think we've covered the majority of what's been happening in markets this week, Megan.
All right, and as we look ahead to next week, another big week report-wise and some things for us to watch. Absolutely. We're going to get cold storage out next week, give us another chance to figure out whether we're backing up any pork or chicken or beef in freezers. We get livestock slaughter information next week, as well as another cattle on feed report next Friday. Give us another opportunity to see what's coming in terms of calf placements. So it will be a full week of reports next week. All right. Good to see you. Have a happy St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, same to you as well, Megan.
All right. To have some market information or to have markets delivered to you twice a day, subscribe to Brownfield's Market Minute with commodity market reporter John Perkins, and to have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your inbox every Saturday morning, go to brownfieldagnews.com, click on subscribe, and you can also submit questions and comments for Scott or myself. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you next Friday. I'm Meghan Grebner on Brownfield.